Have you ever wondered how many masterpieces lay hidden beneath male-dominant narratives in art history? By exploring feminist theory, we uncover societal construct and gender dynamics. This perspective challenges and reshapes the narrative, advocating for equality and diverse voices in our cultural history.
Margaret Keane, known for her paintings of big eye characters, falsely her husband took all the credit for her work. Alma Thomas, another great artist, famous for her busts of W.E.B. Du Bois, faced challenges as a woman and African American artist.
Women have never had the same chances that men have had in the art world. Originally, and centuries ago, the only way women became artists was if they had an uncle or a father who was an artist. They weren't allowed to train the same way. And that's going all the way back to the Renaissance and earlier. 1970s that we have any research being done. And that really happens when we have Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapira Women's House, where they had students get to create installation art, but most importantly with Judy Chicago and the dinner party. And the purpose of the dinner party was to bring back all of these forgotten, lost, misappropriated artists, female artists, that nobody knew in history anymore. There were never any female artists in art history textbooks until the 1980s. I know myself, I went to a women's college. I didn't know about the dinner party, which I find shocking. I didn't learn about a lot of female artists until I was in grad school.
Art student in the 90s. Definitely my art history classes were far more focused on male accomplishments and storing where those accomplishments were stored at institutions. I will say that that there was some coverage of some female modern artists, but Middle Ages was really not covered in the historical record until Mary Cassatt with the Impressionists in the mid to late 1800s.
Too, with when I was in school, it was mostly in art history was mostly men, but then again, I had professors that were men and women, half of them women, and they were strong, amazing artists and strong professors. But for teaching, I guess I try to, when I give lectures or show examples of work, I try to make it as many women as men, try to diverse as much as I can with things. When I'm teaching, I promote women to do strong, great work. I promote everyone to do great work. But I definitely show actually famous women and some women that aren't so famous for slideshows and presentations. And when my students do presentations, they can choose who they want from a long list. So I think that helps.
As far as what art sells for, definitely men's art, it always sells for more. It goes all the way back to artists being misattributed. So there's a lot of artists that female artist work was attributed to men's, and so there just isn't the scholarship there if we're looking at more art historical pieces. Contemporary wise too, I mean, women just aren't getting the individual solo exhibitions, and so their prices are never going to be as high because they're not getting as much exposure.
In this segment, let's talk about apartheid in South Africa, the country that my parents emigrated from to the U.S. For the discriminatory policy, white colonizers came to South Africa and removed natives from their ancestral land, forcing them to live on reserves like Native Americans in the U.S. Black workers would have to migrate to white-controlled areas for work that they would be exploited for. And when economists argued that every race needed to be integrated and educated together, the white ruling class felt threatened. Thus, apartheid was put into law in 1948, banning interracial marriage, social gatherings between races, integrated universities, and forced Black people to be relocated to reserves once again. The history of apartheid in South Africa was met with opposition ever since its inception, and even after apartheid had ended in 1994, the impacts of stratification are still felt today. Here we will highlight some important women and women-centric groups who fought against apartheid.
In order to keep the oppressive power the white minority had over the South African population, they attacked the ability for black and mixed-race people to vote against them in the polls. This catalyzed the creation of a group called the Black Sash, a protest group founded by liberal middle-class white women in 1955. The group was an avenue for women of all races to protest against apartheid on the front doors of racist institutions, as they donned black sashes to mourn the violation of the Constitution. To help victims of removal and police violence, Black Sash members like Nhlangano Beauty Mkhize helped community members get in contact with legal help and hide political activists targeted by the government. The beginning of the end of apartheid was marked in 1990 with the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, as well as the African National Congress no longer being outlawed by the South African Parliament. However, his wife, Winnie Mandela, was still a public figure during his time in jail and intimately active in the political movements against apartheid. While they were together, they represented the idealized heterosexual marriage in modern South Africa, as they represented the relationship between the many men who had been unjustly banished and the women that they were separated from. This defined her view as a mother of the nation, extension of Mandela rather than as an independent fighter, despite her political views and influence predating the coupling of the two. After her imprisonment and torture in 1969, she became much more radicalized, openly supporting violent acts like putting burning tires around the necks of black people who were deemed apartheid collaborators. Historically, women's roles are dictated by structural functionalist views that are combined with cultural imperialism and white supremacy already active in South Africa. For example, Winnie had a difficult upbringing throughout her childhood, as she had experienced strict gendered roles from the moment her mother died when she was 8. She was removed from school for 6 months and was required to do manual labor around the house while her brothers got off the hook. This contrasts Nelson's rural childhood, where gendered roles were of equal influence compared to Winnie having to prove she was just as valuable as a daughter instead of a son to her Christian parents. White supremacy and cultural imperialism has affected symbolic interactionism too, with agents of socialization like schools imposing Africans to adopt Christian names.
Puerto Rico has experienced oppression by the United States and corporate interests. Women were disproportionately affected by policy and structural discrimination, specifically women of color. Laws and views based on racism and eugenics were the foundation for forced sterilization programs in Puerto Rico. Looking through symbolic interactionism, the United States was constructing the populations of different communities of color as undesirable. Puerto Rico is still dealing with the consequences of reproductive discrimination and genocide.
The laws and policies of the U.S. in the late 1800s and early 1900s were tools of discrimination and sterilization of women in Puerto Rico.
The latent reason for the laws was an economic concern. Also, courts said that people didn't deserve full Anglo rights. Citizenship in Puerto Rico is legislated through Congress. It is not a right protected by the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court had said that to apply the Constitution to the island of Puerto Rico would be absurd, and Puerto Ricans were considered alien in their own land. At the turn of the 20th century, Puerto Rico was impoverished. Its economy centered around agriculture, primarily the production of sugarcane, but there was not enough work. So Puerto Rico was deemed to be overpopulated with undesirables. This was the reason women were targeted for sterilization. Disguised as economic and health reform, and after Law 116 was passed, a program of coerced sterilization was pursued. The sterilization that was based in eugenics was an effort to select the right characteristics for the labor force. The result was 1/3 of women in Puerto Rico being sterilized by 1960, the highest percentage in the world. The coercion of these women included misleading them and keeping knowledge away from them that they were being sterilized. In 1956, Margaret Sanger and Gregory Pincus began experimenting on women in Puerto Rico with trials for an early version of the pill. Again, disadvantaged poor women of color were the ones targeted. Victims of these experiments had adverse side effects, reporting nausea, dizziness, and blood clots, but were dismissed as unreliable historians. Sanger, a central figure in these trials, later founded Planned Parenthood, an organization now advocating for reproductive autonomy, yet built upon the legacy of exploiting black and brown women.
One of the sociological theories that can be applied to this discrimination stems in part from conflict theory, describing the power dynamic between the U.S. and the Puerto Rican population. Symbolic interactionism helps to understand how gender was specifically constructed in Puerto Rico when sterilization was occurring. Femininity in Puerto Rico was viewed as central to the constructed problems of population that Puerto Rico faced. The racist ideas of eugenics were views of who was fit to inhabit and do work on the island, and who was unfit. Geneticists believed that poverty was a sign of genetic inferiority, influencing the law to allow forced sterilization. The primary benefactors of this power and control were the men heading the U.S. government as well as the U.S. corporations. The broad-scale misogynistic discrimination of sterilization meets the modern definition of the crimes of genocide, outlined by the UN's Office of Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. From the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment, the fourth definition of Article 2 proves genocide. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Imposing measures to prevent births within the group. With a sociological understanding and feminist lens, we must teach about little known and suppressed history, as well as how the patriarchal narratives are countered. Leaders such as Dr. Helene Rodriguez-Rios and organizations including the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse helped to expose and resist the abuse in the 1970s. Ana Maria Garcia's 1981 film, La Opresión, tells the story of these women subjected to these programs. Writer Shakira Diaz continues to tell the histories of these women.
I think it's really important, based off of this presentation, that you can clearly see how patriarchy as a system influences and impacts all different areas of life. Apartheid, art, health disparities. Clearly we're seeing consequences that are going on regarding the problems of a patriarchal system of inequities. So I think it's important for us to recognize that it isn't just an individual situation. This is larger than us as a social system. So we need to maybe challenge the issue of patriarchy.